The thing that should give you pause before we travel any further back is this. When Maegor the First, the one they called Cruel, was found dead upon the Iron Throne, the great jagged seat of 100 melted swords had opened its own blades into his wrists and driven them into his legs. And in all the years and all the confessions that followed, not one soul in all the 7 kingdoms ever admitted to being in that room. Close your eyes if they are not already closed. The room around you is quieter than King's Landing ever managed to be, and that is exactly the right condition for what we are about to move through together. Let your breathing find its own rhythm, not forced, not deliberate, just the slow and natural movement of air that your body knows how to make without your instruction. There is nothing you need to solve or carry tonight. What we are approaching is a very old story, and old stories have a patience that newer things lack. They have been waiting centuries. They can wait a little longer while you settle into the stillness. We begin in the year 12 after Aegon's conquest, in a world still learning what it was. King's Landing was barely a generation old, a new city growing on the confluence of the Blackwater Rush and the salt-smelling bay, its streets half mud, its great castle unbuilt, its identity assembled from ambition and proximity to power rather than any deep tradition. Aegon the Conqueror had swept across Westeros with his 2 sister wives and their 3 dragons less than 2 decades prior, and what he left behind was not quite peace. Peace takes generations to build and requires the willing cooperation of the people within it. What he left was the exhausted silence that follows overwhelming force, the kind that holds together through dread more than through genuine consent. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. Into that still raw world, Maegor was born to Visenya, not to Aenys, the warmer of Aegon's 2 sister wives, who kept a correspondence with the poets of Lys and rode the dragon Meraxes with something approaching joy. He was born to the harder one. Visenya Targaryen was, by every surviving account, one of the most formidable people the dynasty would ever produce, a statement of considerable weight given what the dynasty eventually yielded. She rode Vhagar, second in size and ferocity only to Balerion himself. She carried Dark Sister, the Valyrian steel blade made light enough for a woman's grip but honed for outcomes rather than ceremony. She had fought in the conquest itself, not as a symbol but as a combatant, and there are records of her being wounded in the field and continuing without comment. She did not know how to be soft, or she had decided somewhere in the cold accounting of her life that softness was a resource best spent elsewhere. It is worth sitting with what it means to be born to a mother like that, in a position like his. Aenys had come first, born of Rhaenys, gentle Aenys, who wept openly at music and commissioned tapestries of the landscapes he loved and had a queen he adored with the uncomplicated devotion that gentle people carry into love. Aenys would be king, that was established, settled, baked into the arithmetic of succession, in a way that was not open to discussion. Maegor was the second son of the second wife, which in the logic of inheritance made him, for most practical purposes, a sword without a scabbard, present, purposeful in theory, recognizably powerful, but lacking the role that would give all of that capability direction. What does it do to a child to be shaped by that understanding from the very beginning? That question does not have a clean answer, but it is the right question to carry into everything that follows. The lessons Visenya gave him were not gentle ones. She supervised his weapons training herself by all the records that survive, and her standards were not those of tournament ceremony, but of genuine, functional, ugly survival. He learned to fight not for galleries of spectators, but for outcomes. He learned the difference between disabling a man and ending one, and he learned it early, before that knowledge had acquired the moral weight it would later carry. She taught him the Valyrian tongue, not as a dead language for scholarly passing, but as a living one. The vowels shaped to carry across wind and distance, the deep consonants formed in a way that had some sympathetic resonance with dragons, some quality in the ancient speech that made the great creatures attend when it was spoken. Though the Meisters of the Citadel have never agreed on the mechanism, she taught him by consistent and patient example that the world was a thing that could be compelled if you were willing to pay the price of compelling it. And always, behind everything else in those childhood years, was the knowledge of Balerion. The Black Dread was still Aegon's dragon, still bound by the living, ineffable bond between dragon lord and beast that no Meister has ever fully explained. But the creature's sheer physical reality was inescapable. It was in the smell of the dragon pit on warm days, a particular combination of deep animal musk and the ghost of burning that never fully cleared from the stones. It was in the shadow that passed across the city when Balerion circled overhead, enormous and unhurried, the shadow of something that had personally turned Harrenhal from the greatest fortress in Westeros into a monument to melted stone and the folly of resisting fire. Most people who were close to Balerion felt what was appropriate, awe, and the specific fear that awe always carries in its lower register. Maegor, by the accounts that survived, felt something different, something that resembled recognition more than fear. Here is what history tends to do with its most terrible figures. It reads their ends backward onto their beginnings, assumes that the child already contained the full shape of the damage the adult would do, that Maegor at 12 was simply Maegor at 35 compressed into a smaller body with less opportunity. But children are not their futures. They are their circumstances first and their choices second, and the choices are only morally significant if we understand the circumstances that preceded them. Maegor was not born cruel. He was born second. He was born to a mother who had no template for raising a second son to anything but extreme readiness. He was born into proximity with the most powerful weapon in the world and told, by every structure around him, that it was not his. What that does to a person, what it did to this particular person, in this family, in this precarious moment in the history of a world still deciding what it was, is the slow unfolding ahead of us. The two half-brothers occupied the same household without ever quite inhabiting the same world. Aenys was musical, warm-natured, the kind of young man who made people instinctively want to protect him, which revealed something quietly important about the limits of that instinct. It could produce loyalty, but not the harder kind of loyalty that holds under real pressure. He had genuine courage, the quiet kind, without an audience, but he was built for a more forgiving age than the one his father had created. Maegor watched this from a consistent, steady distance. He was not contemptuous of his half-brother. Not exactly, though what he felt contained contempt's underlying architecture. He could see the gap between what the world they had inherited would eventually demand and what Aenys was prepared to offer it. What he had not yet answered, in those early unformed years, was what to do with that awareness. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. You have met some version of this position before, in people and houses you already know. When Cersei Lannister stood in the long shadow of her brother's inheritance and understood, with a precision that made it worse, that she was the ablest of the three by almost any honest accounting, and that the world would not organize itself to acknowledge that there is something of Maegor's wound in her fury. Not the same wound. Cersei's circumstances were tangled in their own particular architecture of gender and family and the specific cruelties of her father's approval, but the structure of it, the second-class child who knows accurately that they are first-class material consigned by birth to a secondary role, that structure is recognizable. It does not exhaust itself in one generation. It is a thing the Targaryen line returned to again and again, as though it were an unresolved chord waiting for a resolution that never quite arrived. When Jon Snow stood at the edge of the wall and tried to understand what the world expected from someone born into the gap between what he was and what he was officially permitted to be, the bastard, the secondary, the one who would not and should not inherit, whose capabilities found no sanctioned channel, there is something in that silence that echoes backward through the centuries to this boy in a half-built city. Jon handled it with a quality of self-suppression that Maegor would have found incomprehensible, even contemptible. but the position, the structural loneliness of being exactly what is needed and simultaneously exactly what the existing order cannot accommodate. That position repeats in this family. It is as heritable as silver hair. It is as persistent as the fire in the blood. There is a particular texture to the Dragonstone of those years that is worth inhabiting for a moment. It was a place of black stone and sea wind, cold in the way that volcanic islands are cold. Not the cold of winter, but the cold of deep rock that holds its temperature regardless of the season. The great hall was hung with tapestries that Aegon had brought from Essos, images of dragons in the old Valyrian style, flattened and stylized, and somehow more frightening for the abstraction. The sound of the sea was constant, the smell of the sea was constant, and in the lower galleries of the castle, where the walls were warmest because the dragon lair lay underneath, the stone sometimes felt alive, trembling very slightly, giving off a faint animal heat. Maegor spent much of his childhood near that warmth, near the lair, as close to the dragons as he was permitted to be. It was not permitted very often. He found ways to extend the time. What Visenya understood, and what she communicated to her son through years of careful, deliberate instruction, was that the Targaryen hold on the Seven Kingdoms was genuinely precarious in ways that the victory of the conquest tended to obscure. They had arrived with 3 dragons and 2 sister wives and a man of extraordinary will, and they had won. But winning and ruling are different projects. The lords who had bent the knee were keeping records, waiting for opportunities, raising children who had been taught to remember what they had lost. The faith had accommodated the family's custom of sibling marriage with a diplomatic silence that was not the same as acceptance. The North had submitted without being fully incorporated into the Southern political culture. Every direction offered to a careful observer reasons for vigilance. Visenya was the most careful observer Maegor had access to, and she spent his childhood explaining the landscape of that vigilance with a thoroughness that her son would carry for the rest of his life, even when the carrying became its own kind of burden. Aegon the Conqueror himself was, in his final decade, a man in productive conversation with his own mortality. He had outlasted both of his sister wives. Aenys was dead in dawn, her dragon Meraxes destroyed, and her fate never fully recovered from the silence of those who had held her. And Visenya, though still alive, had aged into the particular remoteness of very old people who have lived through more than the living world can easily contain. Aegon wrote, he read. He received lords and issued judgments and maintained the machinery of governance with the patience of someone who has learned that the most important thing a king does is be consistently present and predictably rational, which is harder than it sounds and more valuable than any battle. He was, in his later years, a genuinely good king. Not because he was gentle, which he was not, but because he had learned from the experience of having been the conqueror that the conquest is the easy part. Let all of that settle into the quieter parts of you. We are only at the beginning, at the long, cold childhood of a man who would eventually do things that even the other Targaryen kings had not fully imagined, but we are not hurrying toward those things. They will arrive in their own weight, in their own time. For now, let the image of a boy in a half-built city watching a black dragon circle the morning sky and feeling not fear, but something that might have been kinship, settle into the slower part of your memory. The fire was always there. It had been there since before he was born. What he would choose to do with it, that is the story that wants to be told. Your breathing is slow. The night is quiet. Your watch for this first chapter is ended. But before Maegor could become the figure history remembers, the burning king, the husband of many queens, the man who executed the builders of his own castle, he first had to approach the largest, most dangerous creature in the world alone and ask it, in the ancient language that neither of them had been born to carry him. Aegon the Conqueror died in the 37th year after his conquest, quietly, at Dragonstone, which is where it had all begun and where the man who remade a continent chose to spend his final days. He had not been the invulnerable figure of legend at the end. He had carried the grief of Rhaenys, his gentler wife, lost in dawn, consumed along with her dragon in a trap that no amount of fire could have saved her from, and that grief had aged him in ways that fire and war had not. When the word went out from Dragonstone, the realm held its breath in the particular way it does when the thing it feared might change has finally changed, and the first question in every lord's mind was not how to mourn, but what came next. What came next was Aenys the First, kind and uncertain, who took the Iron Throne with his dragon Quicksilver and his queen Alyssa, and his genuine desire to be loved by the people he ruled. He was 21 years old and visibly nervous, and the realm, which had expected a hard succession, found itself with something unexpectedly gentle. This might have been a relief. Instead, for the harder elements of the realm, the lords who had bent the knee to Aegon's fire and not to Aegon's authority, the faith which had always found the Targaryen custom of sibling marriage quietly abhorrent, the many ambitious houses who had been waiting for the grip to loosen it read as opportunity. Weakness that wears a crown is still weakness. Maegor was 25 when his father died, and he stood at the funeral on Dragonstone with an expression that those present described differently depending on their sympathies. Some said he wept, some said he did not. What is agreed upon is that he was there and that he was calm, and that somewhere in the days that followed he walked into the presence of Balerion the Black Dread, and the great dragon accepted him. This is a thing that needs to be understood, not glossed over. Dragon bonding was not a guarantee. It was not something a Targaryen could demand by right of blood, though blood was part of it. It was something closer to a recognition, a meeting between two natures that found enough common ground to bear one another's weight. Balerion had carried Aegon for decades. He was enormous, ancient, scarred from the battles of the conquest, and the idea that he would simply accept a new rider because that rider was Aegon's son is exactly the kind of reasoning that gets people killed around dragons. But Balerion did accept him, and the accounts of that first flight together in the chronicles that survive, in the careful language of maesters who were not there but gathered testimony from those who had been, describe something remarkable. The Black Dread, who had become accustomed to a steady master over many years, moved under Maegor with what one witness called an ease that was almost recognition, as though the dragon had been waiting, as though there had always been an understanding between them, conducted at a level below language, that this was the natural arrangement. Maegor on Balerion's back, the Black Dread's shadow falling across the world, that image, which would become one of the defining images of his reign, began not in triumph but in bereavement, on an island of black stone, a day after the most powerful man in the world had quietly stopped breathing. He served as Aenys's hand of the king in the years that followed, hand and half-brother, and, increasingly, the force that held the administration together through the sheer density of his competence. Aenys was not incompetent, he was intelligent, and he had instincts about people that Maegor lacked. But there is a particular kind of intelligence that thrives in peaceful conditions, and a different kind entirely that is required when the conditions are not peaceful, and Aenys's strengths were the wrong ones for what the realm was becoming. The Faith Militant was stirring. The sons of nobles who had bent the knee to Aegon were watching the new king and making calculations. The borders that Aegon had drawn with fire needed to be maintained by something, either the threat of fire or the subtler machinery of genuine governance, and the machinery was not in good repair. Let the quiet of this moment hold for a breath. Because there is something in this period, Maegor's hand, competent and contained, watching his half-brother preside over a kingdom that was slipping, that is worth understanding before the violence begins. He was not inevitable. That is the thing the historical record keeps suggesting, and the thing we must resist accepting too easily. Maegor did not have to become what he became. The conditions produced the possibility. The man made the choices. And for a brief period in those years, there was a version of events in which Maegor's abilities and Aenys's gentleness might have complemented each other rather than colliding. That period did not last, but it was there. His first marriage was to Cerys Hightower, arranged in the years before Aegon died, a match intended to secure the loyalty of one of the realm's most powerful and proudly pious families. The Hightowers of Oldtown sat at the seat of the Faith's power in Westeros, their great tower rising above the city like a flame made of stone, and a marriage to their line was, in theory, a gesture of inclusion, a signal that the Targaryen dynasty could absorb even the institution it had most thoroughly disrupted with its customs. The marriage did not produce children. This is recorded carefully and without elaboration in most of the chronicles, which tells you something about how sensitive the topic was. Cerys bore Maegor no living heirs. The years passed. The absence of heirs in a dynasty built on the backs of dragons was not a small problem. It was the problem, the slowly growing silence at the center of everything. What Maegor felt about Cerys is not recorded with any intimacy. She was a Hightower. Devout, proud, almost certainly aware that her husband was not the careful, ceremonious man her family had perhaps imagined. Whether they were cold to each other, or whether there was something more complicated between them, some mixture of mutual respect and mutual disappointment, is not something the Maesters chose to preserve. What is preserved is the absence of an heir. And it is that absence, that long-running silence in the place where a son or daughter should have been, that drove Maegor toward the decision that would fracture the realm. If you'd rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. The custom he invoked was an old one. Old in the way that Valyrian customs were old, which is to say ancient and half understood even by the people who practiced them. In old Valyria, the Dragon Lords had not been constrained by the faith of the Seven's understanding of marriage. They had taken multiple wives, or practiced what the Valyrian records called polygamy without apology, because the multiplication of Dragon Lords and their particular heritable gifts was considered more important than the sensibilities of any one religious institution. The Targaryens had, of necessity, moderated these practices after the conquest. They ruled a kingdom where the faith held enormous sway, where the great Sept of Baelor would eventually stand as a monument to that influence. But the old customs had not been entirely forgotten. They had been filed away, waiting for a man desperate enough and powerful enough to reach for them. When Maegor took Alys Harroway as his second wife in the 39th year after Aegon's conquest, he was doing something that the faith of the Seven called abomination, that the High Septon called an unforgivable offence against the Seven, and that the Maesters called, with careful neutrality, politically inadvisable. He was also, in his own understanding, doing something rational. He needed an heir. Cerys had not given him one, and the old blood customs of his people provided a solution. The gap between how he understood his action and how the faith understood it was so vast as to be almost unbridgeable. And Aenys, who loved peace and comfort and the absence of conflict, found himself required to choose between his brother and his kingdom's most powerful religious institution. The choosing of Aenys was, in its way, more tragic than any of the violence that followed. He chose neither. He delayed and temporized and hoped the situation would resolve itself, which is sometimes a viable strategy, and in this case was not. The High Septon called for Maegor to stand trial for his bigamy. The lords who had always found excuses not to fully commit their loyalty to the Targaryens found a new and ecclesiastically respectable reason to withhold it. And Aenys, cornered between his inability to condemn his half-brother and his inability to protect him, settled on exile. Maegor would go across the narrow sea. The matter would quiet. Perhaps, in time, a solution would present itself. Maegor went. He took Balerion with him, which meant that Aenys was left on the Iron Throne with Quicksilver, younger, smaller, faster, but not Balerion, and the awareness that his half-brother had not crossed the narrow sea empty-handed. The exile began, and across the narrow sea, in the cities of Essos where no High Septon's writ ran and no Westerosi lord's expectations followed, Maegor spent 3 years becoming something that the realm had not yet had a name for. What exactly he did in those years is imperfectly recorded. The Maesters knew he was in Pentos, at least initially. They knew Visenya maintained contact with him. What they did not know, what has never been fully established, is how he spent the time, what he learned, and what shape he had grown into when he returned. The Faith Militant's reconstitution in the early years of Aenys's reign was a thing that happened in stages, each one small enough to be deniable, collectively impossible to ignore. The warriors' sons began meeting again, not in any formal capacity, not in the crystal armor that they had laid aside, but in the informal way of men who share a conviction and find the company of others who share it necessary. The poor fellows were easier to reconstitute because they had never been formal enough to be effectively disbanded. You cannot disband a movement that never had a headquarters, never had a roll of members, never had anything you could point to and say, "There, that is the institution, remove that and the thing is over." They had always been the travelling holy men, the roadside confessors, the people who appeared at your fire on a winter road and offered prayer for your safe passage. They still were. They were just, in those years, beginning to remember that prayer was not the only thing they had to offer. Maegor's relationship to the faith was not the simple hostility that his later actions might suggest. He was not irreligious. The Targaryens maintained the forms of the faith's observance, attended its services, gave to its septs, because they understood that the faith was not separable from the social fabric of the realm they ruled. His objection was not to the Seven, about whom he had, as far as the record shows, no strong personal feelings in either direction. His objection was to the institutional presumption that the faith had the authority to judge a king's private arrangements, to the idea that a high septon could stand between a dragon lord and his dynasty's customs and say, "This far and no further." That presumption he found intolerable. And the intolerance was not irrational. It was the position of a man who understood that the moment you permit a religious institution to constrain your personal life, you have accepted a principle that has no obvious limit. The years of Maegor's hand were, in their way, the years in which the entire subsequent history of the dynasty was being arranged. The choices being made in those councils about how much accommodation to give the faith, about how firmly to insist on the crown's primacy, about how much of Aenys's genuine warmth toward his people to leverage and how much of it was dangerous in its softness, those choices had consequences that stretched forward by decades. Maegor was in the room for most of them, arguing for positions that Aenys sometimes accepted and sometimes did not. The refusals accumulated, and each refusal was, in Maegor's private accounting, a further piece of evidence for the proposition that the realm needed someone with a different temperament at its center, not necessarily him. His accounting was not that simple, but someone who would make different choices when the moment for choosing arrived. Breathe slowly. The night is deep now, and what comes next is darker than what has gone before. Let the image of those 3 years settle into your imagination without forcing them into shape. A man in exile, across the sea, with a dragon and a purpose and no throne, sharpening whatever it was that lived inside him into something that had not yet found its occasion. The story is not finished. It is barely begun, and the fire across the water would not wait much longer. Your watch for this chapter is ended. Because while Maegor was across the narrow sea, the Faith Militant had been given time to remember its own strength, and Aenys, the gentle king with the smaller dragon, was about to discover what happens when a religious institution decides that a dynasty's tolerance is weakness and not mercy. Let the room settle around you. You have travelled a long way already tonight, through the birth of a hard man and the death of a great one, through the first marriages and the first exile, and the long water between Westeros and the continent where Maegor was sharpening himself against whatever Essos offered. Now we come to the faith, and the faith in this period was not a passive institution. It was an institution that had been watching the Targaryens for a generation with a very particular kind of patience, the patience of something very old and very confident that the tide eventually turns in its direction. The Faith of the Seven had been the dominant religious power in Westeros since long before Aegon landed. It was woven into the fabric of daily life in a way that was difficult to overstate, into marriage and death and harvest and the naming of children, into the architecture of every city with its sept, into the language of oaths and the structure of law. When Aegon conquered the realm and brought his dragon-riding, sibling-marrying family to power, the Faith had made a pragmatic peace. The Targaryens were allowed their customs. The Faith kept its institutions. It was a compromise that worked as long as both sides were willing to maintain it, which meant it worked for exactly as long as a Targaryen found himself in a position where he felt he could not afford to. The Faith Militant, the armed wing of the Faith, the warriors' sons, and the poor fellows, had existed for generations before being formally disbanded in an earlier moment of political negotiation. By the time of Aenys's reign, they had quietly begun to reconstitute themselves. Not quickly, not visibly enough to trigger an immediate response, but with the steady, inexorable momentum of an institution that has always known it will outlast any individual king. When Maegor took his second wife and the High Septon declared the marriage an abomination before the Seven, the Faith Militant did not simply issue a statement. They armed. The warriors' sons put on their crystal-adorned armor again. The poor fellows spread across the roads, and the common people, who had always found a god they could touch more comforting than a dragon they could not approach, listened to them. Aenys's response was to take his family and his dragon to Dragonstone and develop what the historical record describes with some delicacy as a decline in health. This is one of history's more merciful euphemisms. Aenys, confronted with a realm that was actively burning and a family situation that had no obvious resolution, managed the crisis with increasing difficulty, sleeping poorly and eating less and trusting fewer people, which is a pattern that tends to compound the problem rather than solve it. There was a question, whispered in certain circles and recorded in certain marginalia, about whether Visenya, who had always found her son's half-brother more suited to kingship than her nephew, helped that decline along. The Maesters do not commit to an answer. They record that Visenya was at Dragonstone with Aenys in his final weeks, and that she was not, by reputation, the kind of woman who found weakness sympathetic. Sit with that for a moment, with the quality of that particular silence. A king dying, perhaps of grief, perhaps of something administered with more deliberate care, while his half-brother waited across the narrow sea. Visenya maintaining her correspondence, keeping the thread between herself and her son intact across the water. The Faith Militant burning the septs of lords who had been too friendly with the Targaryens, spreading through the countryside like something that had been contained and was now discovering how large it could grow. And at the center of all of it, the Iron Throne, which cuts everyone who sits upon it and cuts differently depending on how the weight of the person pressing against it is distributed. Aenys had been pressing against it too lightly. The throne, in its way, was already preparing for someone who would press harder. Aenys the First died in the 41st year after the conquest. He was not old, he was in his mid-30s, which in that age was not yet elderly, though it was not young either. He died at Dragonstone in rooms that smelled of the sea and the particular cold that the island never quite loses even in summer. His queen Alyssa was there, and his children were there, and Visenya was there, and whatever Visenya felt as she watched her nephew die is a thing the chronicles do not have language for. She was not a woman who left much of her inner life on the record. What she left instead were actions, and the action that followed the death of Aenys was one of the most consequential of the age. She sent for Maegor. She crossed the narrow sea herself, or had him brought across. The accounts differ on the exact mechanics of the return, which suggests the people involved were not eager to be specific about the choreography of a seizure of power. What is agreed upon is that Maegor arrived at King's Landing in the 42nd year after the conquest, with Balerion, the largest dragon in the world, and with an expression on his face that those present described as very calm. Aenys's son Aegon, later called Aegon the Uncrowned, had a legitimate claim to the throne. He had blood and support and his own dragon and every legal right by the rules of succession as anyone understood them. Maegor had Balerion, and Balerion, in the sky above King's Landing that morning, made certain arguments that the law of succession found difficult to counter. The lords who might have spoken loudly for Aegon, the Uncrowned's claim, found themselves studying the shadow that passed across their rooftops and making the kind of rapid, pragmatic calculation that is one of the few reliable constants of political history. A year later, when Aegon the Uncrowned raised his banner in open defiance, they would calculate again and come to a different conclusion. But on the day of Maegor's return, the calculation was simple. Here was Balerion. Here was the man who rode him, and the man was clearly not going to be redirected by conversation. There is something in the texture of those days, the specific atmosphere of a city that has just watched an enormous black dragon land in its harbour and discharge a king who was not supposed to be king, that resists the usual historical framing of events as inevitable. Nothing was inevitable. Every person who bent their knee or remained standing was making a choice under enormous pressure, with incomplete information, in a world that had no precedent for exactly this configuration of power and fire and grief and ambition. The maesters who recorded it understood it as a coup, which it was. But it was also something stranger, the culmination of 30 years of a man being told he was the wrong shape for the world he lived in, and finally deciding, in the way that certain people eventually decide, that the world needed to be a different shape. The first thing Maegor did after arriving at King's Landing, before he formally claimed the throne, before he dealt with the lords, before he turned his attention to Aegon the Uncrowned's waiting claim, was fly Balerion to Visenya's hill. The Faith Militant had built a great armory there, in the shadow of the hill's great sept. Maegor's message to the Faith was delivered not in words, but in fire. What had taken years to build was reduced to rubble and ash in a matter of minutes. The sept itself, the Sept of Remembrance, which had stood on that hill for over a century, burned. Hundreds died inside it. The stone melted in places where Balerion's fire found it at a sustained angle, and the records describe a smell across King's Landing that did not clear for days. Let the weight of that settle, without rushing past it, a religious site, centuries old, burned by a dragon on a man's instruction. The people inside it, not soldiers in that moment, but the kind of people who had found their way into a building they believed sacred, turned to ash and memory. Maegor's message to the High Septon and to the Faith Militant and to the realm was not subtle. It was not intended to be subtle. He was making an argument that the other side of the Targaryen bargain with the Faith was not patience and accommodation, but this, fire, and the will to use it without hesitation or apology. In the quiet of tonight, let that contrast hold in your mind. The man who wanted an heir, the faith that called his desire for that heir an abomination, the years of exile across the sea sharpening, and then the return, and the fire, and the smell that did not clear for days. History does not give us characters who are simply evil or simply justified. It gives us circumstances and choices, and the choices compound each other until the pattern becomes almost impossible to step outside of. Maegor had stepped inside a pattern that now had its own momentum. He was the burning king. The sept was ash. And the realm was watching with the specific attention of a world that has just been told what the new rules are. The exile across the narrow sea was not the straightforward punishment it appeared to be from the outside. Maegor did not go as a prisoner. He went with Balerion, which meant he went with the most powerful weapon in the world under him, and the people of Pentos and the surrounding free cities were aware of this in the most practical sense. They did not need to be told that the enormous black dragon which had landed outside their city walls belonged to a man who had a complicated relationship with his king. They could see it. and they organized themselves around that visibility with the speed and pragmatism that the cities of Essos have always brought to the accommodation of inconveniently powerful guests. What Maegor did with those 3 years is one of the genuine mysteries of the period. The maesters who were tasked in Jaehaerys's later reign with compiling a complete account of Maegor's life found the Essos years almost completely opaque, not because records did not exist, but because the records that existed were fragmented, inconsistent, and occasionally contradictory in ways that suggested they had been compiled by people who either did not know what they were looking at or who had reasons not to say clearly what they had seen. There were mercenary companies in the disputed lands that would later describe, when pressed, a man who had fought with them for a season whose skill was extraordinary, who had not given a name. There were scholars in Volantis who recorded a visit from a Westerosi lord, not named, who had been interested in the old Valyrian texts on dragon lore. There were the cities themselves, none of which had a complete story. Visenya's death, which came in the 44th year after the conquest, after Maegor had returned and taken the throne, closed the longest thread in the story of the early Targaryen dynasty. She had been alive for all of it, for the planning of the conquest, for the crossing of the narrow sea, for the burning of Harrenhal and the Field of Fire and the submission of the great lords, for the building of King's Landing, for the death of Aegon and the uncertain reign of Aenys and the return of her son. She had outlived 3 kings. She had, by the most sympathetic reading of the evidence, shaped one of them in ways that his reign would spend its duration making visible. When she died on Dragonstone of age done, she was in her mid-70s, which for a Valyrian dragonlord was not unusual but was not young either. The court received the news with the particular quality of silence that descends when someone dies, who was so large a presence that you had stopped being able to fully see them. Maegor's response to his mother's death is not recorded in any document that survives. He continued, "Let your breathing slow. Let the image of fire on a hill very far away and very long ago become a piece of the past rather than the present. The night is quiet. The stories will keep. Your watch for this chapter is ended." But Maegor on a throne was not the same as Maegor secure on a throne. Because Aegon the Uncrowned, Aenys's eldest surviving son, young and brave and riding his own dragon, had not bent his knee, and he had support, and he was coming. The question of legitimacy in a world where dragons exist is more complicated than it appears. We tend to think of legitimate succession as the thing that keeps a kingdom stable, the clear, agreed-upon line of inheritance that removes ambiguity and prevents the waste of war. And in theory, that is what it does. But the theory assumes a world in which the power to enforce succession is evenly distributed, in which the heir can actually take and hold what is theirs. In a world with dragons, the distribution of enforcement is not even. It is concentrated in whoever sits on the largest fire-breathing animal, and the largest fire-breathing animal, at the dawn of the 42nd year after the conquest, was under Maegor. Aegon the Uncrowned knew all of this. He was not naive. He was young, barely into his 20s, and he was idealistic in the way that young people who have been raised to believe in the justice of their cause can be idealistic, which is to say, he believed in his claim with a fervour that was genuine and that reality was not going to honour. He had Quicksilver. He had lords who had committed to his cause. Lords who had calculated that Maegor's grip on the throne was not yet secure enough to make opposing him suicidal. He had the sympathy of the faith, though the faith's sympathy was a complex gift that came wrapped in conditions, and he had, above all, the legal right. Succession law, by any reading the Maesters could produce, placed the crown on his head. But law, in the absence of the force to enforce it, is a letter that no one is obligated to deliver. The battle that came in the 43rd year after the conquest fought at the pass called the Golden Tooth, where the road that connects the Westerlands to the Riverlands narrows between high rock faces, was not a battle between equals. It was a battle between a claim and a dragon. Aegon the Uncrowned came with his army and with Quicksilver, his pale silver dragon, beautiful and quick, who was perhaps half the mass of Balerion and who had never been in a battle before this one. Maegor came with Balerion, who had burned the Reach and the Westerlands and the Riverlands in the original conquest, who had personal knowledge of what a castle made of stone does when sustained fire is applied to it. The battle on the ground was decided by more conventional means, men with swords and the usual terrible arithmetic of armies in close contact, but the battle in the sky was what the chroniclers remembered. Quicksilver was faster. She moved with a speed that the older, heavier Balerion could not match, climbing and diving and using her agility the way a smaller combatant uses it against a larger one, trying to find the angles that the size differential could not simply overpower. For a little while, a brief, heartbreaking while, according to the accounts that survive, it looked as though speed might matter. And then Balerion turned in a way that something his size should not have been able to turn, and Quicksilver's fire met Balerion's fire, and Balerion's fire was the older and larger of the two. Quicksilver died in the sky above the Golden Tooth. Aegon the Uncrowned fell with her. Or perhaps he survived the fall and died on the ground. The accounts are not consistent on this point, and the inconsistency is itself meaningful. A suggestion that no one who was present found the aftermath of that particular death, something they wanted to describe in detail. He was young, he had ridden his dragon against the largest dragon in the world because he believed his claim was just, and the claim was just, and the justness of it was simply not the relevant variable. The realm was silent about this for a long time. Not because it did not understand what had happened, but because it understood it very clearly and did not know what to say. Let us sit with the weight of what the death of Quicksilver means beyond the immediate political consequences. A dragon dead is a dragon gone from the world permanently. Dragons, in the understanding of the maesters who have studied them most carefully, do not regenerate their numbers easily. The Targaryen family had arrived in Westeros with 3 great dragons. By the 43rd year after the conquest, one was dead in dawn, one had just been killed above the Golden Tooth, and Vhagar, Visenya's dragon, the last of the original 3 Dalm, was aging as dragons age, which is slowly but with an end that eventually comes. The burning of Quicksilver was not only the burning of a claimant, it was the burning of a piece of the world that could not be replaced. Every dragon death diminishes the total store of wonder in existence, and those deaths had been accumulating. Maegor's victory at the Golden Tooth consolidated his hold on the throne in the way that decisive military victories consolidate things quickly and completely for a period of time until the next crisis. The lords who had supported Aegon the Uncrowned did what defeated lords do in the short term. They submitted, bent their knees again, and waited to see what Maegor's reign would actually look like up close. Some of them were forgiven because Maegor understood that wholesale slaughter of the nobility was counterproductive to the administration of a kingdom. Some were not forgiven. The distinction between the two groups was not always clear, which was itself a kind of governance. Keeping the lords uncertain about their standing encourages a careful attentiveness that certainty does not. What came next was the Trial of Seven. It is necessary to understand the Trial of Seven as an institution before understanding what happened when Maegor invoked it, because the institution itself is important. The Trial of Seven was a formalized version of trial by combat, the idea that the gods would reveal the truth of a matter through the outcome of a fight, but taken to its most elaborate expression. 7 champions on each side, chosen to represent the 7 aspects of divinity, fighting until one side's champions were all dead or incapacitated. It was ancient, rarely invoked, requiring the consent of both parties and a willingness to commit 7 lives to the resolution of a question. When Maegor's enemies, the lords and Septon-aligned knights who continued to contest his legitimacy, challenged him via this mechanism, Maegor accepted. He accepted personally he would be one of the 7. This was not required. A king could theoretically provide 7 champions and watch from above. Maegor chose to be present in the fighting himself, which told the realm something important about what he was. He was not a king who directed violence from a safe distance. He was a king who was the violence, who had been trained since boyhood to be the sharpest point of whatever force was brought to bear. The 7 champions who stood against him that day were not ordinary men. They were knights of genuine accomplishment, chosen specifically because they represented the highest martial capability that his opponents could field. And Maegor walked into that circle knowing this. If this history is settling into your bones the way it should, consider subscribing. The next story will be waiting when you return. What happened in that fight is one of the most discussed episodes in Targaryen history, and the discussions have never fully settled on a single interpretation. The facts, as the Meisters recorded them, are stark enough. By the time the fighting ended, 6 of the 7 champions against Maegor were dead. The 7th, it is sometimes said, died of his wounds in the days that followed. Maegor himself was standing when it ended, or at least he was the last person standing before he was not standing at all. He collapsed. His own people carried him off the field, and he did not wake. Not that day, not the next day, not for 30 days. 30 days. Think about what that duration means in the life of a court that had organized itself around a man who was suddenly absent. For 30 days, the lords of the realm did not know if Maegor would wake. For 30 days, his wives, his queen Cerys, his second wife Alice Haraway, attended him in rotation. For 30 days the Maesters gathered and conferred and said, with the careful language of men who did not want to commit to a diagnosis they might have to reconsider, that the king was in a deep and grave condition and that time would tell. For 30 days the realm held its breath in the way it does when the thing at the center of everything has stopped moving. The 7 champions who stood against Maegor in the Trial of 7 were not chosen carelessly. His enemies, the coalition of faith-aligned lords and institutional opponents who had organized the challenge, had assembled the best they could find. These were men with real histories, real victories behind them, whose martial records would have been impressive in any context that did not also include Maegor. The logic of trial by combat is that the gods reveal the truth through the outcome, which means the outcome is understood as meaningful regardless of what it demonstrates about the physical capabilities of the people involved. When Maegor killed his first champion, the watching crowd understood it as they were supposed to understand it. When he killed his second, something had shifted. The understanding was becoming more complicated. By the 4th, the silence of the crowd was a different silence than the one that had preceded the fighting. There are accounts, not numerous, and not in the official chronicles, but in marginalia and in the kind of private correspondence that occasionally survives when families preserve their letters, of what the crowd that watched the Trial of 7 experienced. The accounts describe a quality of stillness that grew as the fighting continued, the specific stillness of people who are witnessing something that has exceeded the frame they were given for understanding it. Trial by combat has a logic. One person wins, one loses, the gods have spoken. When the ratio becomes 6-0 and the 6 are dead, and the 1 is still standing, the logic of the institution is not quite adequate to the phenomenon. People did not cheer when Maegor finished. They stood in the silence that follows the end of something that was not what anyone expected it to be. Alice Haraway was at his side when he collapsed. This is one of the details that the sympathetic accounts of Maegor's life return to, not because it romanticizes him, but because it humanizes the scene in a way that is easy to overlook when the scene is otherwise so extreme. She had loved him, or had felt whatever the Haraway version of love was. A thing shaped by the circumstances of their marriage and the pressure of the court and the specific difficulty of being attached to a man who operated at the scale Maegor operated at. She sat with him for 30 days. She attended the chambers where he lay. She did not leave. Whether this is evidence of genuine attachment, of political calculation, of something in between, the accounts do not fully resolve it. What they record is the presence. She was there, and she stayed. and when he woke he was alive, and for a period after that, something between them was not entirely gone. He woke on the 31st day. The accounts of his waking are varied, as accounts of extraordinary events always are, each witness remembering a different detail. The quality of the light in the room, the first thing he said or did not say, whether he seemed like the same man who had gone into the fight or like someone who had gone somewhere else during those 30 days and returned with knowledge that had no name. What the chroniclers agreed on was this: he was alive when he should not have been, and the realm was not certain in the days that followed whether to call that a mercy. Breathe. Let the strange weight of that survival settle into the darker corners of your imagination. A man fights 7-0. 6 die. He falls. 30 days of silence. Then he wakes. The history of Westeros does not have a clean framework for what that is. The Faith called it a miracle of the Seven, though they immediately had to deal with the fact that the Seven had apparently seen fit to preserve a man the High Septon had called an abomination. The Targaryen loyalists called it proof of the blood. The common people, who are usually the most honest about these things, called it frightening, and they were not wrong. The watch for this chapter is ended, but do not let it go too quickly. Hold the image of the 31st morning, the room, the king opening his eyes, and the entire court that had been waiting with its collective breath, held now needing to decide what his survival meant and how to respond to it. Some questions the future will answer, and some questions it will not. Because what Maegor brought back from those 30 days in the dark, whatever he had seen or become in that long stillness, would make the remaining years of his reign unlike anything the Seven Kingdoms had witnessed before. And the first sign of it was the Black Brides. Let your body rest fully into the surface beneath it. There is nothing required of you now. We are moving into the quieter hours of Maegor's story, not quieter in the sense of peaceful, because peace was not something his reign produced in quantity, but quieter in the way that darkness is quiet, deeper than the events of the day, but also stranger. What we are entering now is the chapter of the Black Brides, which is what history calls the 5 women Maegor took as wives after the death of Alis Harroway, and the answer is that the label is not metaphorical. These were real women taken from specific families in circumstances that were not entirely voluntary, to serve a purpose that the king believed he needed them to serve. They wore black to their weddings. The colour was their choice, or it was the colour they were given. The accounts are, on this point, not specific. Maegor's need for an heir had by this point become the organizing principle of his reign in a way that is almost impossible to fully appreciate from this distance. He was a king without children in a dynasty that had no clear succession if he produced no children. He had no legitimate siblings. Aenys was dead, and Aenys's own children were either dead or in hiding, or in the case of the youngest, Jaehaerys, carefully removed from court by a mother who understood that proximity to Maegor was not currently safe. The bloodline that had conquered and held a continent was concentrated in those years in one man with no heir, and that man was aware of it every day. Cerys Hightower, his first wife, had given him no children. Her family had arranged the marriage as a bridge between the Targaryen dynasty and the Faith stronghold in Old Town, and whatever Cerys had brought to it personally, the biological outcome had been silence. The Masters recorded this without assigning blame, which was politically wise of them. Alis Harroway, the second wife whose marriage had cost Maegor his exile and the realm its stability, had produced pregnancies. This is where the records become troubling in a specific and difficult way. The infants, the things delivered from Alis's pregnancies, were not alive in any ordinary sense. They were, in the clinical language of the Citadel's archives, malformed beyond any possibility of survival. Twisted, the Maesters wrote, carefully, misshapen, born dead or dying within moments, in ways that suggested something had gone deeply wrong at the level of the body's fundamental architecture. It is worth considering what this accumulation of loss did to Maegor, independent of what he did with it. He was a man who had been prepared for hardship and never for grief. Visenya's instruction had been comprehensive in the arena of battle and power and the application of force. It had not prepared her son for the particular suffering of watching again and again the evidence that the most important thing he needed to produce was beyond his reach. He had killed 6 men in single combat and woken from 30 days of unconsciousness and burned septs and ridden the largest dragon in the world. He could not produce a living child. That specific incapacity, in a world that measured a king's worth in heirs, sat in the center of everything like a stone no amount of fire could reduce to ash. The speculation that has always surrounded the dead pregnancies falls into 2 broad categories, and both of them are uncomfortable in different ways. The first is medical, that the Targaryen habit of close-kin marriage, practiced across generations in the Dragonlord families of old Valyria and maintained in the dynasty's history, had produced a bloodline that carried some accumulating fragility, that the same concentrated fire in the blood that gave the Targaryens their dragons and their heat resistance also carried, somewhere in the weave of inheritance, a tendency toward the most extreme outcomes, either the healthiest and most exceptional children, or the worst. This theory does not require any magic and is uncomfortable primarily because of what it implies about the cost of concentrated power. The second theory is the one that the common people were more drawn to, which is generally a sign that it connects to something true, even if not in the way the common people imagine, that there was a curse. Curses, in the world of Westeros, are not necessarily metaphorical. The children of the forest left marks on the world that lasted for thousands of years. The magic of the old religion was not gone, even in those centuries, merely diminished. And Visenya, who had consulted with people of various arcane traditions in her time, who had a reputation for methods that were not strictly orthodox, had she done something, either to produce an heir or to ensure one, that had gone wrong in the way that the application of old powers often goes wrong? The Maesters do not engage with this question directly. Its presence in the record is the pressure of its absence. The 5 black brides were taken between the 43rd and 45th years after the conquest. Their names are recorded, and they are worth holding for a moment, because they were real people who found themselves in one of the stranger positions that the history of this world offers. Women required to marry a king who was increasingly feared, increasingly isolated, increasingly defined by the pattern of loss that his household had become. Some of them, by the record, attempted to make something of their situation. Some found ways to be present in the court that were not entirely defined by their role as potential mothers of an heir. And some died, one at least under circumstances the records describe as sudden and unexplained, and that we do not need to examine in detail here because the weight of what is known is sufficient without the weight of what is only suspected. What is worth understanding is the geography of the isolation. Maegor had arrived in Westeros as a terrifying force. He had won his throne with fire and with the trial of 7 and with the blood of the conquest concentrated in his veins. But terror, as a governing strategy, has a lifespan. It works while the thing that generates the terror is present and visible and credibly capable of following through. The moment the Lords of the Realm began to calculate that the costs of opposition were lower than the costs of continued submission, the moment his succession began to look genuinely unresolvable, his behavior genuinely unpredictable, his grip on the administration of the kingdom genuinely loose, the geometry of fear began to shift. He was losing them, not quickly, not all at once, but in the particular slow way that a tide recedes without any single moment that you can identify as the turning point, just the gradual accumulation of small retreats until you look up and the shore is far away. Lords who had bent their knees were finding reasons not to attend court. Communications that should have generated responses were going unanswered. The Faith Militant, which he had driven underground with fire, was still underground, but underground is not the same as destroyed, and the roots of something that has been in existence for centuries are hard to fully excavate. Maegor's reign was not ending, not yet, but the quality of it was changing. The silence around him was becoming a different kind of silence than the one he had been in the center of before. The women who became the Black Brides were not selected from among the families who had opposed Maegor most openly, which would have been cruder than his court was even in its deteriorating state. They came from houses whose allegiance was ambiguous, families that had been neither firm supporters nor outright opponents, who occupied the uncertain middle ground that makes them useful as political instruments. To bind them to the king through marriage was, in the logic of dynastic politics, to resolve the ambiguity in favor of the crown. It was also, in the honest accounting, to expose those families to the most immediate and intimate consequences of whatever Maegor's marriage life had become. The pregnancies that ended badly, the atmosphere of grief and secrecy, the specific pressure of being inside a household that had stopped being able to discuss the most important thing happening inside it. The question of who bore the cost of Maegor's need for an heir most directly is answered in the historical record with a specificity that is worth acknowledging. The women paid. They paid in the ordinary currency of the period, in the transfer of their persons and their futures to a man who did not consult them, in the subsequent pregnancies and their catastrophic outcomes, in the atmosphere of a court that had organized itself around an impossibility and was developing, around the impossibility, the specific psychological texture of a place where everyone knows the truth and no one says it. The masters who attended these pregnancies wrote their reports carefully, in the controlled language of men who understood that what they were observing was both medical and political, and that precision in the political dimension was more dangerous than precision in the medical one. There is a detail in one of the lesser chronicles, not Gildane, not the main sequence, but a citadel manuscript of uncertain authorship that dates from within a generation of the events it describes, that captures something of the atmosphere. It describes a morning in the Red Keep during Maegor's middle years when a servant, entering one of the queen's chambers to deliver the day's first meal, found the room empty and the window open, and the sound coming through the window was not bird song or city noise, but something that the servant could not categorize at the time and later described as the absence of sound, a quality of silence so complete in a room that was normally occupied, that the servant stood still for a full minute before closing the window and leaving with the untouched tray. The chronicle does not explain this scene, it simply records it. Some images are their own explanation. What the accumulation of grief did to Maegor's physical and psychological condition in those middle years is a question that the chronicles approach with the careful indirection of people who found the answer uncomfortable in ways that complicated their narrative of a simply cruel king. He had been, in his youth and early manhood, remarkable in his physical capabilities. The trial of 7 was the most dramatic evidence, but the everyday accounts of his swordsmanship and his governance suggest a man operating at an extremely high level of sustained performance. In the middle years, after the pattern of the pregnancies had become undeniable, there are accounts of a different quality in his public appearances. A heaviness, a tendency toward stillness where there had been motion, a silence in council meetings where there had been decisive statement. Whether this was exhaustion or grief metabolized into something that had no other form to take, the accounts do not explicitly say, but the change is recorded even by those who had reason to minimize it. Balerion was aging. This is perhaps the most portentous background detail of Maegor's middle and late reign, the one that the chronicles mention in passing but that deserves a slower consideration. The Black Dread had been ancient when Aegon first bonded with him. Born in Old Valyria, before the Doom, he was the only living creature in Westeros who had personal memories of what Valyria had been, and those memories were not translatable into any language that the people around him could receive. By the time of Maegor's reign, Balerion was very old. Still enormous, still capable of the fire that had made him legendary, but slower in his movements, less inclined to the long flights, more often to be found in the dragon pit, sleeping in the position of very large things that have found the exertion of wakefulness increasingly optional. Maegor was bound to a dragon who was winding down, in a reign that was winding down, toward an ending that neither of them had the resources left to prevent. Breathe. Let your body remember that it is safe. that this is a very old story and you are resting in the present, which is quieter than anything in that court was. The fire in the blood does not always burn what it intends to burn. Sometimes it burns the hand that holds it. The watch for this segment is ending, and the next one leads deeper into the question of what Maegor built. Not his dynasty, which he could not sustain, but the thing made of stone and secret passages and the bodies of the people who built it, which would outlast him by centuries and still holds the most important people in the realm within its walls even now. Because before the reign ended, before the lords made their calculations and the fire went out, Maegor built something. He built it on a hill in King's Landing, with the best builders in the realm and a promise of payment and a feast at the end. And the feast was not what the builders expected. The Red Keep was not always there. This seems obvious, stated plainly, but it is worth holding for a moment because the Red Keep has been so central to everything that happened in the later centuries of Targaryen rule, and to everything that happened in the years we think of as the recent history of this world, that imagining the hill without it requires a deliberate act of reconstruction. Before the Red Keep, there was Aegon Fort, the rough timber structure that Aegon the Conqueror had built when he first landed, and that served as his court until something more permanent could be arranged. And then there was the hill itself, with its godswood and its open sky, and the city growing up around it. Maegor commissioned the Red Keep in the early years of his reign, and the plans he gave to his builders were not simple. He wanted something that would not just be a seat of power, but a thing that embodied the Targaryen understanding of power. Impregnable, extensive, full of the kinds of redundancy and hidden capability that allow a dynasty to survive the worst that its enemies can offer. He wanted walls that would not burn, which is a particular irony given that the king giving the instruction was a man who rode a dragon. He wanted secret passages. He wanted chambers within chambers and doors that did not announce themselves as doors. He wanted, in the truest sense, a building that could keep secrets, because he understood that the most valuable asset any family can have is information that its enemies do not possess. The master builder who oversaw the project was a man of considerable skill, working with teams of labourers and craftsmen drawn from across the realm and, according to some records, from Essos as well, Myrish stonecutters, specialists in the particular kind of hidden joinery that allows a door to sit in a wall without visible seam. People whose skills in the mechanics of concealment had made them valuable to the kinds of clients who needed concealment. They worked for years. The castle that rose on the hill above King's Landing grew, in fits and starts, around its inner logic. The great throne room, the holdfast that bore Maegor's own name, the towers that could see the bay and the river and the dragon pit and the Sept Hill, the passages underneath. When it was finished, or finished enough that the occupancy could begin, because a building of that complexity is never truly finished, Maegor gave a feast. This is recorded in several places, always with the specific language of formality that suggests the people who wrote it down understood that something important had happened and were being careful about how they framed it. The builders were invited, the craftsmen were invited, the people who had spent years learning the castle's bones, who knew where the hidden doors were and what the passages connected and how to move through the building without being seen. They were all invited to a celebration of the work's completion. They did not leave the feast, not alive. The exact number varies by source, but the figure the maesters most commonly cite is around 2,000 souls, an almost incomprehensible number, the number of people who constitute a small village, the number of people who have names and families and things they had planned to do once the work was done. Maegor had them killed. Every one of them who was present, everyone who had learned the Red Keep's secrets by the nature of their work, was executed at or after that feast. The instrument of this execution, whether it was soldiers who entered the hall or something slower administered over the course of the evening, is not specified in the records that survive, which is not an accident. We should sit here, fully, not hurry past this in the way that large numbers invite us to hurry. the way that the scale of a thing makes it abstract rather than real. 2,000 people. 2,000 people who had built something extraordinary, who had contributed to the castle that would house kings and queens and all the machinery of a kingdom for centuries. 2,000 people who understood their world as craftsmen understand theirs, through the knowledge of their hands, through the satisfaction of joinery and stonework, and the particular pleasure of a thing well made. 2,000 people who went to a feast and did not come home. Their families afterward would have had questions that no one answered. Their families would have learned, in the days that followed, to stop asking. This is one of the clearest windows into what Maegor's cruelty actually was. Not the burning of the Sept, which was at least a military action against an armed institution, not the Trial of Seven, which operated within the formal logic of its own ancient rules, but this. This was the deliberate execution of people who had committed no crime except to know something the king did not want known. This was the application of absolute power to an absolutely ordinary problem, the problem that secrets, once shared, are no longer secrets, with the solution that the rest of humanity would have found monstrous. Maegor did not find it monstrous, he found it practical. And yet, and this is the thing that sits at the center of the Red Keep story, the thing that makes it more than simply an atrocity, the secrets were kept. The passages that Maegor ordered built, the hidden doors and the underground tunnels and the spaces within spaces that only he had a complete map of, they remained unknown to the people who moved into the castle after him. They remained unknown for decades and centuries. They were discovered, some of them, only gradually, by people who stumbled into them by accident, or who inherited knowledge that had been passed down through very specific and very limited channels. The Red Keep kept its secrets because Maegor made sure that the only people who fully knew them were dead. The echoes of this in the history that followed are significant in a way that the people living through the later centuries did not always understand. When Cersei Lannister moved through a passage between the Tower of the Hand and the chambers of the Small Council, she was moving through something that Maegor had paid for in blood. When the Spider Varys appeared in rooms that no one had seen him enter and left rooms without anyone observing his departure, he was using the architecture of a dead man's paranoia. When young Arya Stark explored the castle she had come to as a girl from the cold north and found passages that the servants who had lived there their whole lives did not know existed, she was discovering the bones of a king's absolute determination that no one would ever know his castle better than he did. If this history is settling into your bones the way it should, consider subscribing. The next story will be waiting when you return. The Red Keep has never been fully mapped. This is a fact that the current administration of King's Landing lives with, in the same matter-of-fact way that inhabitants of old buildings live with the knowledge that there are parts of their structure they have never fully explored. There are rooms that have not been opened since Maegor's time. There are passages that connect points in the castle that no current occupant knows are connected. The building is, in a very literal sense, still holding the secrets that Maegor paid for with 2,000 lives, and the building does not care that those lives were the price. The building simply stands and holds, the way that stone holds everything it has been told to hold, without judgment and without mercy. The construction itself took years longer than planned, which was not unusual for a project of that ambition, and was not, in the case of the Red Keep, entirely explainable by the usual complications of logistics and labor. Maegor changed the plans. He changed them more than once, sending the builders back to redesign sections that were already underway, adding passages and chambers and sublevels that were not in the original commission, requiring modifications to work that had already been completed, tearing out finished sections and having them rebuilt to different specifications. The builders learned over the course of those years not to assume that what they were building on any given day was the final version of what they were building. This was expensive, and it was slow, and it was exactly what Maegor intended because the multiple revisions served a purpose beyond the architectural. They distributed the knowledge of the castle's final form across such a large number of iterations that no individual worker had a complete picture of what the building ultimately was. This is worth understanding as a strategy rather than simply as cruelty, though it is both. Maegor was, in the construction of the Red Keep, solving a genuine problem that every powerful person who has ever built a stronghold has had to solve. The people who build your fortress know your fortress. They know the weak points. They know the hidden passages. They know where the walls are thinnest and where the foundations are deepest and where you have placed the things you most need to protect. Every locksmith who has ever put a lock on a safe faces the same structural vulnerability. The solutions that history offers are limited. You trust the builders and hope they remain trustworthy, or you eliminate the builders and accept the moral cost of that elimination. Maegor made the second choice, with a thoroughness that removed any ambiguity about the kind of man he was. The feast itself is described in the accounts that survive with a detail that is almost certainly reconstructed rather than observed. The arrangement of the tables, the quality of the food, the presence or absence of music. These details have the quality of things that the chroniclers felt the scene required, rather than things that witnesses reported. What is not reconstructed, what the underlying records support more directly, is the fact of the invitation and the fact of the outcome. Thousands of people went into the Red Keep at Maegor's invitation and did not come out. The castle absorbed them. The records of their families, in the tax rolls of their home areas, in the guild records that tracked the movements of skilled craftsmen, simply stop. The entries are there, and then there is nothing, and the nothingness has the specific shape of a deliberate absence rather than a natural one. Centuries later, when the Red Keep had become the center of the dynasty's life in every practical sense, the passages that Maegor had built and paid for with those lives would function in ways that he had intended and in ways that he had not. He had intended them for his own use, for the private movements that a king needs to make without observation, for the ability to appear in rooms without being seen to enter them, for the security of knowing that his castle had dimensions that his enemies did not have access to. What he had not anticipated, or perhaps had not thought to care about, was that the secrets he was burying with the builders would eventually be unearthed, not all at once, but gradually, by the generations that followed him, by the people who were curious, by the people who were careful. By the people who were motivated, as Arya Stark was motivated, by the specific energy of a young person in an unfamiliar place who finds a door that is not supposed to be there and pushes it open. Let the image of the castle settle. The red stone that catches the light of certain sunsets and holds it, the towers visible from the bay, the great gate, the throne room with its terrible centerpiece. The Red Keep is where the story of Westeros lives, in its institutional sense. It is where the small councils meet and the ravens arrive, and the decisions are made that determine whether the realm has another season of peace or another season of war. It is also, somewhere in its lower passages and forgotten chambers, still full of the intentions of a man who killed 2,000 people to make sure he was the only one who truly understood it. The buildings we inhabit are never only buildings. Your watch is ending for this chapter. Rest in the quiet of it. The stones of the Red Keep are very far away, and you are very comfortable, and the fire is very old. Sleep is closer than history tonight. And yet, even with the castle built and the secrets secured, even with Balerion still in the sky and the realm still technically under his rule, Maegor's grip was loosening. The lords were watching each other more than they watched him, and in the shadows of the realm, a boy was growing toward the age of dragons. The unraveling of a reign is never a single event. That is the part that the simplified versions of history tend to get wrong. They look for the moment when everything changed, the day or the battle or the decision that marked the clean transition from stable to unstable. But real political disintegration is not like that. It is cumulative. It is the accumulation of small calculations made in private by lords and advisors and high officials, each one seemingly minor, each one adding its weight to a shifting balance that no single actor can see in its entirety because they are all inside it. By the 47th year after Aegon's conquest, the balance had shifted, not completely, not irreversibly perhaps, even then. But the direction was clear to anyone watching with clear eyes. The Faith Militant had not been destroyed. Maegor's burning of the Sept of Remembrance and his subsequent campaigns against the armed orders had scattered them, driven them underground, killed significant numbers, but the Faith Militant's strength was never primarily in its numbers. It was in the quality of its connection to the common people, who had always found the Seven more accessible than a dynasty and a dragon, and that connection could not be burned away because it was not made of stone. It was made of the kind of quiet social tissue that holds communities together. The shared observances, the local septon who knew your name and your grief, the festivals that organized the year, the idea of a power that cared about ordinary human concerns in a way that a king on a throne high above the city did not necessarily. The warriors' sons and the poor fellows had reformed themselves quietly and with patience in the countryside that Maegor's fire could not reach all at once. The poor fellows in particular moved through the realm like water moves, finding every gap, every road, every farmstead where the king's authority was theoretical rather than actual. They did not need to win a battle. They needed only to persist, to remind the common people with their presence that the faith was still present, still active, still undefeated in the most fundamental sense of being still alive. Against an institution with that quality of persistence, a king with a dragon faces a specific and difficult problem. You can burn a building, but you cannot burn an idea out of the minds of 1 million people without burning the people. And burning the people is not governance, it is simply destruction. The lords felt this at a structural level before they could articulate it as a political position. The reliability of the small folk, their willingness to pay taxes, to provide labor, to remain reasonably accepting of the authority that sat above them, is the foundation on which every other aristocratic calculation rests. A peasantry that has been given a reason to resist is a different problem than a peasantry that is merely enduring. Maegor's methods had given the common people a reason. Not a reason that translated immediately into organized resistance, but a reason that made the ordinary business of extracting revenue from the land more expensive and complicated than it needed to be, and that made the lords who administered that extraction quietly resentful of a king whose policies were making their own lives harder. There was also the question of Jaehaerys. He was the youngest surviving son of Aenys the First, young still in those years, barely past boyhood. But he had a claim that the law recognized, and he had a dragon, a she-dragon named Silverwing, and he had what Maegor had never fully been able to cultivate despite all the fire at his disposal, the sympathetic attention of people who might be persuaded to support him. Jaehaerys was not Aenys. He would not prove to be the kind of gentle, uncertain king his father had been. He was something more complicated and ultimately more durable. A man who would turn out to understand that the governance of a kingdom requires the cooperation of more stakeholders than just the person who holds the largest weapon. But he was still young in those years, and the question of whether he would ever be in a position to test that understanding was not yet decided. Maegor summoned his lords. In the 48th year after the conquest, with the Faith Militant reforming in the countryside and the lords growing increasingly distant in their obedience, he issued the summons that a king issues when he needs to reassert his presence, a command to attend court, to present themselves physically in the capital, to stand in the room with him and be reminded of what they owed and to whom. Lords who had been ignoring communications were less likely to ignore a direct summons from a man with Balerion. The summons went out. Most of the lords did not come. They sent messages full of the elaborate courtesy that high-born people deploy when they want to be polite about something that is actually a refusal, explaining why they could not attend at this particular time, citing the demands of their own lands, the welfare of their small folk, the difficulties of the season, the particular regrets of men who understood very clearly that they were deciding something permanent by their absence but had decided it nonetheless. Some of them had already declared for Jaehaerys, though carefully and in language that preserved the technical possibility of retreat if the political weather changed. Others had not yet committed explicitly, but their absence from the summons made the commitment visible enough. it is difficult not to feel something in this picture, something that sits at the border between sympathy and its opposite. Maegor, in those last weeks before the end, in a castle whose builders he had executed, surrounded by wives who had given him only grief, with a dragon that was aging and lords who were not coming, and a faith that had survived all his fire, was he capable by that point of understanding what had happened? Did he know, in the way that people sometimes know things they cannot admit even to themselves, that the pattern was complete? That the thing he had been since boyhood, the second son, the sword without a scabbard, the force without a direction that the world had prepared for, had finally found its limit? If this history is settling into your bones the way it should, consider subscribing. The next story will be waiting when you return. The chroniclers do not give us Maegor's internal life in the final weeks with any intimacy. What they give us is the external picture. A court thinning, a castle filling with the particular quality of silence that descends when an institution is not quite sure of itself anymore, a king sitting on a throne that cut him the way it cut everyone who sat on it. They give us the accounts of the lords who had committed to Jaehaerys gathering their forces, beginning the slow movement toward the capital that would either end in a confrontation or in an abdication, and they give us the knowledge of what was found on the morning that followed. He was found dead on the Iron Throne. This is the fulcrum around which all of Maegor's legacy turns, the final fact that refuses to yield a clean answer. The blades of the Iron Throne, the great rough spurs of fused swords that make the seat deliberately uncomfortable, that had cut Aegon the Conqueror himself, that had drawn blood from every king who ever sat on them for long enough, had opened into Maegor. His wrists, his legs. The wounds were significant, whether they were sufficient to have caused death on their own, whether they were primary or secondary, whether the blood loss alone killed him or whether something else killed him first and the throne's blades found their openings in the process of a dying man's final movements. The masters who examined him could not agree. The theories have accumulated over the centuries the way sediment accumulates, slowly in layers, each one adding its weight to the structure without quite resolving it. One theory holds that Maegor killed himself, that he understood, in the final night, that his reign was over, that the lords were not coming, that the pattern of loss had finally completed itself, and that he chose, in the manner of a man who had always been something closer to a weapon than to a person, to end on his own terms rather than on someone else's. There is a quality to this reading that is almost tragic, almost sympathetic. The hard man, the second son, the sword without a scabbard, deciding at the last that the scabbard he would find was the throne itself. The arithmetic of Maegor's court in its final years is the arithmetic of subtraction. Where Aegon the Conqueror's court had been full of the energy of a dynasty newly established and still surprised by its own success, and where Aenys's court had been full of the warmth and the cultural activity that a king with artistic sensibilities naturally attracts, Maegor's court in its last phase was full of empty chairs, not literally empty. The court never stops being populated, but empty in the sense that the people filling them were filling them out of necessity rather than loyalty, and were calculating on any given day whether their continued presence served their interests or whether the balance had shifted toward absence. The calculation was shifting. The chairs were metaphorically emptying in the way that institutions empty when the thing at their center stops being worth organizing around. The High Septon, who had condemned Maegor's marriages and called for his trial, had himself died of natural causes, in the way that very old men eventually die of natural causes, though the timing was convenient enough that rumours attached themselves to the convenience. His successor had not moderated the faith's institutional position. The faith's position was structural, not personal, which meant that the death of one High Septon was not the end of the institution's challenge to Maegor, but only the replacement of one vessel of that challenge with another. The new High Septon maintained, in the careful language that senior religious figures use when they are aware of being recorded, the faith's consistent view that certain of the king's arrangements were not consistent with the Seven's teaching, and that the faith's responsibility to its flock required it to say so. Maegor's fire could burn a building, it could not burn a position. There is a letter preserved because the family that received it was thorough in their record keeping and because Jaehaerys's later archivists understood its historical value, that passed between two of the realm's major lords during this period, discussing the situation with a frankness that the official record does not permit. The letter does not name the lords explicitly. The names have been redacted, possibly by the archivists who found it, and understood that the families involved were still powerful and that the letter contained opinions that had been inconvenient even in a later reign. What it contains is a discussion of the specific threshold at which continued support for Maegor became more dangerous than opposition to him, not in the abstract, but in the concrete terms of what resources each signatory controlled, what relationships they had with the other major houses, and what the likely outcome of a coordinated withdrawal of support would be. The threshold, they concluded, had been reached. The letter is dated several months before Maegor's body was found. The common people's experience of Maegor's unraveling was shaped by the specific way in which the collapse of central authority expresses itself in the daily textures of a pre-industrial society. The roads became less safe, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, the king's men becoming less regular in their appearances, the bandits and the Faith Militants' poor fellows filling the gaps with their different varieties of demand. The trade routes that connected the major cities slowed as merchants calculated that the costs of moving goods through an uncertain landscape exceeded the margins those goods could generate. The annual cycles of taxation became more erratic as the collectors found themselves negotiating with local lords who were increasingly not entirely certain that the king they were collecting for was going to be the king next year. These are not dramatic details. They are the material truth of what a failing reign looks like from the inside of an ordinary life. Another theory holds that he was killed by one of his remaining household, someone close enough to the king in those final hours to do what needed to be done and willing to accept the cost of doing it. One of his black brides, perhaps, in a final act of refusal. His hand, perhaps, a man who had watched the realm deteriorate and made the calculation that the deterioration had to stop at its source. The accounts do not provide a murderer because no one confessed, and in the absence of confession, the evidence of the throne room that morning was ambiguous enough that certainty was not available. Let your breathing slow. The mystery will not resolve tonight, and that is all right. Some questions that history asks are questions it intends to keep. The story of Maegor's death is one of them, a puzzle box that history has been passing between its hands for centuries, turning it over, finding no opening. The Iron Throne kept its secret the way the Red Keep kept its passages, completely and without apology. Your watch for this chapter is ended, and the morning after Maegor was found, the realm began the remarkable project of deciding what to do with everything he had left behind. A castle built on secrets, a dynasty with no heir of his blood, and the long, unfinished question of how to rule without burning everything that stood in the way, the morning after. Consider the specific quality of the morning after Maegor's body was found. The kind of morning that arrives after a great storm and finds the world changed but still standing, the wreckage distributed in ways that will take years to fully inventory. King's Landing had spent 6 years under a king who governed by fire. The court had spent those years learning a very specific set of survival skills. How to be present without being visible, how to agree with the minimum necessary conviction, how to serve without becoming indispensable in a way that generated scrutiny. These are not the skills of a healthy institution. They are the skills of people inside an institution that has stopped being safe, and they leave marks. Jaehaerys arrived not immediately, but within the frame of weeks that a young man with a dragon and the support of the realm's major houses needs to arrive when the obstacle between him and a throne has been removed. He was 14 years old, or thereabouts, which the history of Westeros will teach you is not necessarily too young for significant governance. The dynasty had a long tradition of forcing its children into positions that required adult judgment, with results that ranged from remarkable to disastrous. Jaehaerys would prove to be remarkable, though that is a story for another night. What matters here is the quality of what he inherited. He inherited a realm in which the Faith Militant was still formally armed and active, in which the lords had just demonstrated their willingness to withhold compliance from a king they found intolerable, in which the succession had just gone through 2 contested changes in 2 generations, and in which the only clear, unambiguous institution that still functioned with anything like its original authority was the Red Keep, Maegor's castle, built on 2,000 dead, standing on its hill above the city with its secrets intact. Jaehaerys was a different kind of king. He would spend his reign, which would prove to be the longest of the dynasty and arguably the most effective, undoing carefully, systematically, and with genuine respect for the complexity of what he was undoing, the damage of the previous few decades. The echo of Maegor in Jaehaerys' reign is the echo of an absence. Everything Jaehaerys did was shaped by the awareness of what Maegor's methods had cost. When Jaehaerys negotiated with the Faith and eventually reached an accord that would last for generations, he was negotiating against the backdrop of Maegor's burning, using the memory of that burning as evidence of what the alternative to negotiation looked like. When Jaehaerys treated with his lords and brought the realm into something closer to genuine administrative coherence, he was building on the foundation of their experience of Maegor's court, where their input was unwelcome and their survival depended on their invisibility. Maegor's failure created the conditions for Jaehaerys' success, which is one of those historical ironies that looks neater in retrospect than it felt at the time. But we should not rush too quickly into the more comfortable reign that followed, because to do so is to let Maegor's story collapse into prologue, to treat him as merely the necessary darkness before the dawn, as though his significance is entirely contained in what he made possible for his successors. The significance runs deeper than that. Maegor was the first Targaryen king to demonstrate comprehensively and without ambiguity that the dynasty's power was not limitless, that fire and a dragon did not actually resolve the fundamental problem of governance, which is the problem of obtaining the sustained cooperation of people who have the option, at some cost, of withholding it. He demonstrated this by failing to resolve it. And dynasties that learn from their failures at high cost are sometimes paradoxically made stronger by the learning. Think about what the realm knew after Maegor that it had not known with the same specificity before. It knew that the Faith could survive Dragonfire if it was willing to go underground and wait. It knew that the lords, if presented with a king who made their lives sufficiently difficult, would find each other and find an alternative, even at the risk of the confrontation that opposition implied. It knew that the Iron Throne, the literal object, the seat of swords, was not a passive receptacle for power, but something with its own logic, its own tendency to extract a price from the people who sat on it, and that the price could be terminal. These were not small pieces of knowledge. They were the kind of structural truths that a political culture carries in its bones long after the specific events that generated them have been processed into history. The Red Keep itself is perhaps the most tangible legacy, the most literally durable, the thing that Maegor left behind that has continued to affect the world in concrete and specific ways. The hidden passages that Varys used with such expertise in the later centuries. The network of tunnels under the hill that allowed for the movement of people and messages in ways that the official corridors could not accommodate. The chambers within chambers, the architectural paranoia that Maegor built into the bones of the place, thinking of himself when he commissioned them, but serving in practice whoever had the knowledge and the need to use them. The castle thinks like Maegor, in concealment, in redundancy, in the assumption that the most important information is the information that your enemies do not have. When Daenerys Targaryen stood in the ashes of King's Landing and looked at the Red Keep intact in the end, despite everything that burned around it, she was looking at something that Maegor had made, the walls that held, the passages that survived. the building that outlasted its builder by centuries and would outlast whatever came next, because Maegor had been very specific in his paranoia about making something that did not have obvious weaknesses. There is a grim satisfaction in that, and also a grim irony. The man whose reign produced so little that endured built a building that endured nearly everything. The legacy and the blood is harder to trace but not less real. The Targaryen tendency toward the extremes, toward the heights of Jaehaerys's patient wisdom or the depths of Maegor's destructive intensity, is a pattern that the dynasty carried for its entire history so consistently that the masters eventually gave it a name. The coin, they called it. The Targaryen coin, with greatness on one side and madness on the other, and no reliable way to know, when a new Targaryen was born, which side was facing up. Maegor was not the first instance of the coin landing badly, but he was perhaps the most clarifying one. The reign that made the pattern undeniable by making it so extreme that even the most sympathetic chronicler could not paper over it. The coin that would spin again centuries later, when Aenys II sat on the same throne and burned the same city with the same indifference to the lives of the people inside it. Aenys was not Maegor, and their situations were not identical, and the parallels can be drawn too tightly in ways that obscure as much as they reveal, but the structural element is present. The Targaryen who has learned that fire resolves problems and has stopped being able to learn that fire does not resolve all problems. That figure appears more than once in the dynasty's history, and Maegor is where he first appears in his fully realized form. The way that Jaehaerys handled the specific problem of the Faith Militant tells you something about the lesson that Maegor's failure made available. Rather than fighting the institution, rather than attempting to burn away its personnel and its infrastructure as Maegor had done, producing a result that was expensive in lives and resources, and had generated an institution that was bloodied and driven underground but entirely intact in its convictions. Jaehaerys negotiated. He met with the High Septon. He listened to the Faith's concerns, which were the same concerns the Faith had always had, and which were not going away regardless of what the Crown's official position was. He made concessions that were, in the honest accounting, more symbolic than substantive, because what the Faith actually needed was not the specific policy outcomes it was demanding, but the experience of being treated as a partner in the governance of the realm rather than as an obstacle to be overridden or a threat to be burned. The negotiation took time. It produced a compact that held for generations. Maegor could have done it. He had chosen not to. The lords who had abandoned Maegor in his final months came to Jaehaerys with the particular combination of relief and embarrassment that characterizes people who have been on the wrong side of a situation and are grateful to find themselves, without having to make any especially difficult personal choice on the right side of the next one. Jaehaerys received them without significant recrimination, which was politically wise and also, by the accounts that survive, genuinely characteristic. He was not a man who found grudges useful, which made him different from every other Targaryen who had sat on that throne to that point. He understood that the Lord's defection from Maegor had been, in the final accounting, correct, and that treating it as a betrayal to be punished would only establish the precedent that lords who correctly identified a failing king and acted accordingly were to be punished for their accuracy. This was not the precedent a wise king wanted to establish. The question of what to do with Maegor's widows, the surviving black brides, the women who had been taken as political instruments and had survived the experience of his household, was handled with a care that the Maegor years had not accustomed the realm to expecting. They were released from whatever obligations remained. Their families were compensated in the specific way that courts compensate for things they cannot undo, with land and titles and the official weight of the Crown's acknowledgement that something had not been right. Some of them went home. Some of them did not have homes to go back to in the same form they had left them. The historical record does not follow their subsequent lives with any particular attention. which is characteristic of the way that women pass through official history when they are no longer necessary to the official story. They were real people who had been inside the most concentrated experience the Targaryen dynasty had yet produced, and the official record lets them go without looking back. Balerion lived on, under Jaehaerys, without a rider for a time, and eventually bonded with Viserys, the prince who would become Viserys the First, the last of the Dragon Lords to claim the Black Dread before the dragon finally died, ending a life that had begun in Old Valyria and that had been the instrument of Aegon's conquest and Maegor's terror and the everyday astonishment of generations of ordinary people who had seen him in the sky. The death of Balerion is recorded with more solemnity than the deaths of most kings. The dragon had been the last living connection to Old Valyria, the last thing in the world that had personally experienced what had been lost when the doom came. When he died, that connection was severed, and the world was diminished in a way that no new dragon hatching, however magnificent, could fully compensate for. They do not make Balerions anymore. The world was not running that template again. Let the stones of the Red Keep stand in your imagination for a moment. The great walls, the towers, the passages underneath that no one has ever fully mapped. Let Maegor's presence in those walls be what it is, the presence of a man who understood some things with great clarity and some things not at all, who built something that outlasted him and contained in its architecture a faithful record of what he was. The fire in the blood does not always serve the hand that holds it. Sometimes it builds things. Sometimes those things are useful to people who would have been horrified by the builder. That is the nature of legacies, and of buildings, and of the long and complicated relationship between what we intend and what we leave behind. Your watch for this chapter is ended. Rest in the quiet. The walls of the Red Keep are very far away and very old, and you are comfortable, and the night is deep. But the full weight of what Maegor left behind, not just the castle and the passages, but the understanding of what a Targaryen reign looks like when it loses its connection to anything beyond its own fire, would not be fully felt for another 150 years. When Aenys II took the throne, the dynasty's memory of Maegor was still there in the bone, and it would shape everything that followed. There are names in the history of this dynasty that the schoolroom version teaches us as heroes: Jaehaerys the Conciliator, Viserys the First, the old king whose long reign was the dynasty's golden age. And then there are names that the schoolroom teaches as warnings, as what not to do, as cautionary illustrations of the price of excess. Maegor the Cruel sits at the head of that second list. But the schoolroom version, as always, misses the texture. It misses what it actually felt like to be living in the realm as Maegor's grip was loosening, not from the perspective of the lords who were abandoning him, but from the perspective of the ordinary population for whom kings are always somewhat theoretical and fire is not. The common people of Westeros in the 47th and 48th years after the conquest were living through something that did not have a clean name in the political vocabulary of the age. They were living through the failure of authority. Not the dramatic, sudden failure of a battle lost or a city sacked, but the slower, more disorienting failure of an authority that was still theoretically in place, but practically diminishing by degrees. The king's ravens still flew. The king's officers still collected taxes, or attempted to. But the roads were less safe, because the Faith Militant's poor fellows were on them in increasing numbers, and the king's men were in decreasing numbers, and the two groups did not interact peacefully. The harvests went where they went. The prayers were said in septs that were not entirely sure whether they should be open or closed. For the small folk, the question of who was king was always somewhat abstract. The name at the top of the hierarchy did not always translate into something they experienced directly in their daily lives. What they experienced was the local lord, the local septon, the local grain prices, the local safety of the roads. And in the late period of Maegor's reign, those local experiences were becoming more uncertain, more variable, more expensive in the way that uncertainty always makes things more expensive. The wars and the counter-wars between the Crown and the Faith Militant had churned through farmland and disrupted supply lines and redirected labor from cultivation to fortification in ways that added up slowly to the kind of grinding material difficulty that wears down a population's patience with whoever is nominally responsible. We tend to forget this, the material dimension of political history. The way that the accumulation of small economic damages produces the social preconditions for the large political changes that then get recorded as the important events. Maegor's reign is remembered for its fire and its marriages and its Tower of Seven Deaths. It is less often remembered for the disruption to the grain supply of the Riverlands, for the cost to the Iron Throne's treasury of maintaining the campaigns against the Faith Militant across multiple years, for the gradual diversion of resources from the administration of the realm to the prosecution of a war that could not be won by the methods being applied to it. These things are boring. They are also real. And they are what created the material substrate on which the political drama of the unravelling played out. House Lannister had been watching from the Westerlands with the particular attention of a house that has survived long enough and acquired enough resources to understand that the primary obligation of a great house is to still be a great house at the end of whatever is happening. The Lannisters had bent the knee to Aegon. They had observed Aenys. They had watched Maegor with careful attention, and had found in those final years that watching with careful attention was no longer sufficient, that the choice to remain neutral was itself becoming a choice with consequences, and that the consequences of choosing Jaehaerys, if Jaehaerys proved to be the future, were likely to be better than the consequences of having remained attached to a king who was clearly no longer securing the things that kings are supposed to secure. House Baratheon in the Stormlands was in a slightly different position, closer to the Faith's traditional strength in the south, more directly affected by the disruptions in the surrounding regions, more directly exposed to the consequences of the roads being unsafe. Boros Baratheon, or whoever held Storm's End in those final years of Maegor's reign, made calculations that were specific to the Stormlands and arrived at conclusions that were not identical to the Lannister calculus but pointed in the same direction. Not to Maegor, toward a future that did not have Maegor in it. The Starks in the north were, as the Starks always are, somewhat removed from the immediate politics of the south while still being attentive to them. The North is a kingdom that has survived the longest by the straightforward strategy of being extremely difficult to conquer and therefore not worth the cost of conquering, and by paying careful attention to who holds power in the South without ever becoming so attached to any particular southern power structure that the inevitable change becomes existential. Rickard Stark, or whoever held Winterfell then, understood Maegor's End the way the North understands most southern political crises, as something to watch, to respond to minimally, and to position oneself to survive whatever came after. And what was coming after was in those final weeks becoming clear even to the people who least wanted clarity. Jaehaerys was gathering. The lords who had not responded to Maegor's summons were finding each other in the way that the uncommitted find each other when the time for remaining uncommitted is over, in careful communications, in dispatches passed through intermediaries, in the gradual emergence of a shared understanding that the situation required a decision and that the decision had effectively already been made. The formal acknowledgement was still ahead of them, but the substance of it was settled. There is a melancholy in this picture that does not belong to Maegor alone, though it belongs to him most centrally. It belongs also to the idea of him, to what he represented and what he could have been and what he was not able to be, given the materials he had been given to work with and the choices he made with those materials. He was in many ways the most capable Targaryen since Aegon himself in the purely physical sense of martial ability and dragon mastery, almost certainly the equal of his father and possibly his superior. He was not lacking in intelligence. He was not lacking in the quality of decisive courage that a king is required to have. What he was lacking, what his mother's instruction, however thorough, had not equipped him with, was any functional mechanism for incorporating the perspectives of the people he ruled into his understanding of what was needed. Visenya had taught him to compel. She had not taught him to persuade. She had taught him to overpower. She had not taught him to negotiate. She had given him, as fully as she was able to give anything, the instruments of force, and force, as a governing strategy, has a ceiling that Maegor reached and then exceeded, and the exceeding of it is what we call his reign. He could win every battle and still lose the war, and he did, because the war he was fighting was not a war with armies, but a war with the ongoing consent of the people he governed, and consent is the one thing that cannot be compelled. Breathe. The air around you is quiet and still. The night has moved into its deepest hours, and you are very nearly at rest. What remains of Maegor's story is the last thing. The final morning, the empty throne room, the question that has been waiting at the end of everything we have told tonight. It is worth carrying that question gently, without pressing too hard against it, because the question is the point. The answer, if there is one, does not change what the question reveals. And what the question reveals is this: that the most powerful king in the history of Westeros at that time, the man who rode the Black Dread, who killed 6 men in single combat, who built the castle that still stands, was found alone, at the end, in a room full of blades, and no one was willing to say they were there. Maegor's court in its final configuration was a small thing by the standards of what Targaryen courts would later become. The great halls were not empty. Courts are never empty because there are always people whose interests are sufficiently tied to the center that they cannot afford to leave even when leaving would be safer. But the quality of presence in those halls had changed. The people who remained were not the people who had come to court because they wanted to be there, because they found the king's presence inspiring or the court's culture stimulating or the opportunities that proximity to power generates genuinely valuable. They were the people who had nowhere better to go, or who calculated that their specific holdings were too closely connected to the crown's favor to risk a withdrawal, or who had made choices earlier in the reign that bound them to its outcome. They were the residue of a court, and the atmosphere of residue is specific, cautious, lateral-eyed, speaking carefully, and listening for the qualities of other people's speech rather than the content. The intelligence that reached Maegor in those final months was also compromised in the way that intelligence becomes compromised when the institution gathering it is losing coherence. The ravens still came. The reports were still written. But the reports were written by people who had learned over the course of the reign that certain kinds of accurate reporting were unwelcome, and that the gap between what was reported and what was true was a gap that existed for reasons other than simple incompetence. Maegor was not getting an accurate picture of his realm because the mechanism for generating accurate pictures had been, by his own governance style, selectively degraded. The lords who were deciding not to come to his summons had sent reports earlier in the process suggesting that things were fine. They had said what was safe to say for as long as saying it remained useful, and then they had stopped saying anything. The night before Maegor was found dead is not described in any surviving account in real time. What we have are reconstructions, accounts written after the fact by people who were assembling what they could from what others told them, filtered through the understanding of what had happened and therefore inevitably shaped by that understanding. The reconstructions agree on some things: that Maegor was in the throne room that night, that he had dismissed his attendants at some point in the evening, that what happened between the dismissal and the morning when the chamber was opened is not known from direct testimony. They disagree on others, on the quality of his mood in the preceding days, on whether he had said anything that in retrospect seemed meaningful, on whether the throne room had been locked from inside or simply found unguarded. The disagreements are themselves informative. They suggest that the people doing the reconstructing were working with fragmentary and possibly managed information. What we can say, standing at this distance from those events, is that the death of Maegor closed something. Not simply a reign, which is the obvious thing it closed. It closed a possibility. The possibility that the Targaryen dynasty, with all the fire it commanded, might govern in the mode of absolute force without consequence. Maegor had attempted this with more thoroughness and more capability than anyone before him, and the attempt had failed, not in the dramatic sense of being defeated in battle, but in the more fundamental sense of simply not being sustainable. Power without the cooperation of the governed is not power. It is the performance of power, and performances have limited runs. Maegor's run had ended, and the ending was quiet, which was perhaps the most surprising thing about it, given all the fire that had preceded it. Your watch for this chapter is ended. Let the quiet hold you. The story has one more turn, and it is the most important one. Because the morning they found Maegor, the morning the throne room was opened and the court gathered and the guards were questioned, and the silence that met every question was itself a kind of answer. That morning settled something about the Iron Throne that has not been settled since. That the throne itself is the most dangerous seat in the world. Not because it makes you a target, but because it makes you alone. We come now to the last chapter. Let that settle in your body, the sense of an ending, which is not the same as the sense of a conclusion, because the story of Maegor the Cruel does not end in the way that satisfying stories end, with a lesson made explicit and a moral delivered and the shape of things made clear. It ends in ambiguity, in the kind of productive uncertainty that history uses when it wants to make sure we keep thinking about something long after the narrative frame has closed. Let your breathing deepen. Let the darkness behind your eyes be comfortable. We are almost at rest. The final night. No one can say with confidence what the final night actually contained, because the people who were present, if anyone was present, did not describe it. What the record does give us is the final morning. The chamber doors opened. The guards or servants or whoever it was that entered first found the king on the throne. He had been there long enough that the quality of the finding, the specific details that would indicate whether it was early or late in the night that he had died, was not recordable with precision. The throne held him. The blades had done what the throne's blades do to everyone eventually, though usually more gently, usually drawing blood rather than drawing death. In Maegor's case, the meeting between the man and the throne had been terminal. The lords and maesters and court officials who gathered in that chamber faced a very specific and very unusual set of political pressures. They needed to process what had happened in a way that was accurate enough to be credible, ambiguous enough not to be dangerous, and rapid enough that the news could be managed before it spread in a form that could not be managed. This is one of the reasons the historical record is so thin on the specific details, not because the people who were there were incapable of observation, but because what they observed was exactly the kind of thing that the instruments of institutional power instinctively organize themselves to obscure. The three theories that have accumulated over the centuries are all plausible, and none of them is definitively established, and this is not an accident. It is the shape of the problem. The first, Maegor killed himself. The second, someone in his household killed him. The third, the Iron Throne killed him, as it eventually kills everyone who presses against it too long and too hard without the wisdom to recognize the pressure. None of these theories requires the others to be false. They are not mutually exclusive. A man can be driven to the point where he does not resist the throne's blades. A person can be helped toward a death that was already imminent. The throne can be the instrument of a death while not being the agent of it. The mystery's durability is partly a product of the fact that several of its possible solutions are simultaneously compatible with the evidence. What is not ambiguous is this: no one confessed. In all the years that followed, in all the interrogations and investigations and the careful accounting that Jaehaerys and his council undertook when they arrived to take possession of the castle and the throne, no one was ever charged, no one was ever implicated beyond the level of suspicion, and no one stepped forward voluntarily to claim responsibility. The silence was complete, and complete silence, in a room full of people who all had reasons to know things, is not the same as the absence of knowledge. It is the active management of knowledge, The decision made by someone or several someones that certain things would not be spoken aloud, in the understanding that what is not spoken becomes what is not known, and what is not known cannot be used against you. There is something worth sitting with in this silence, something that tells us as much about the reign as any of the events we have spent the night moving through. Maegor had governed through fear and fire and the absolute conviction that he was the most dangerous thing in any room he entered. He had killed to keep his secrets. He had burned to keep his position. He had spent 6 years making himself the undeniable center of the realm's political life. And in the end, the realm's response to his death was silence. Not grief, not anger, not even, in most of the accounts that survive, relief expressed directly, just silence. The specific silence of people who have learned in a hard school that naming what you feel about the powerful is its own kind of danger. Jaehaerys would take the throne and in time prove to be everything that Maegor was not. Patient, politically intelligent, willing to lose small battles in service of winning the larger strategic ones, genuinely interested in the welfare of the people he governed. His reign would be the longest of the dynasty and by most accounts the most stable and the most beneficial. And in Jaehaerys' long reign, the shadow of Maegor was always present as the implicit contrast, the proof of concept for what happens when the dragon's fire is allowed to govern without the human judgment that the fire requires to be useful rather than simply destructive. Jaehaerys was the answer to a question that Maegor had posed by living it. But Daenerys Targaryen, centuries later, would ask the same question again. She had dragons, she had fire. She had a cause that she believed was just and a certainty about her own rightness that came from the same concentrated source as Maegor's certainty. The Targaryen blood, the Dragon Lord's inheritance, the knowledge that the fire in you is real and powerful and has remade the world before. And she found, as Maegor found, that the fire does not discriminate between the just and the unjust, between the people who deserve what the dragon brings and the people who do not, between the city you want to liberate and the city you have allowed yourself to destroy. The fire is fire. It is the mind and the heart behind the fire that determine what it means. And those things are not reliably consistent across the years and the grief and the loneliness. When Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen as he actually was, as he finally learned, faced the question of what to do with a dragon that had burned a city and a queen who had not been able to stop herself from burning it, he was facing a question that the dynasty had been generating since the moment Aegon the Conqueror chose to use his dragons as instruments of political consolidation rather than as creatures of a natural world that deserved some portion of freedom. The question of what fire costs, the question of who pays, the question of whether the blood that makes you capable of the greatest deeds also makes you capable of the worst ones, and what you do with that double inheritance. Maegor answered it one way. Jaehaerys answered it another. Daenerys reached for a third answer and found that the third answer was also not available. And somewhere in all of that, in the dynasty's long conversation with the question of its own fire, there is a thread that leads back to this room, this throne, this morning, and the man found dead among the blades with no one willing to say they were there. He was the first to fully inhabit the problem. He was the first to demonstrate comprehensively that the dragon is not enough, that the throne is not enough, that fire without wisdom is not governance but catastrophe in slow motion. He was the Cruel, and he earned that name, and the name contains a truth about what he did with what he had. But the truth is not complete unless you also know that what he had was real, that the capability was genuine, that the competence was not entirely misplaced, that in a world that had been more fair to him in his original positioning, he might have been remembered differently. He was not the villain. He was not the hero. He was the second son of a dragon, given too much power too late, shaped by a mother who gave him every weapon except the most important one, carrying a wound that he never found a way to put down. He was the Iron Throne's most honest mirror, the thing the throne makes of people when the people it gets are exactly wrong for it, and the throne is still there. The question it poses is still the same question, and no dynasty that has sat upon it has found, in any permanent way, the answer. If you have traveled this far tonight, through fire and exile and the long unraveling, consider subscribing. There is another story waiting when you return. Let your eyes remain closed. Let the candles in your imagination burn very low. The history you have traveled tonight will be here tomorrow. Maegor and Balerion and the Red Keep and the Silent Throne Room and the question that no one has ever fully answered. None of it requires you to carry it right now. You have been a good listener. Good. You have stayed with the difficult parts. You can rest now. The specific nature of the Iron Throne as a cause of death, if it was the cause, is something the Meisters have approached with the tools of the Citadel rather than the tools of metaphysics, and their analysis is worth considering on its own terms. The throne's blades are real and they are sharp, in the way that very old metal that has been maintained for ceremonial purposes is maintained but not dulled. Present, capable, waiting for contact. A person sitting in the throne with the weight of ordinary governance can receive minor cuts, the kind that are irritating and occasionally embarrassing, but not terminal. A person sitting in the throne in the specific physical configuration of someone who has lost consciousness, who has fallen forward or sideways, or into the blades in the manner of unconsciousness, rather than the controlled manner of someone aware of the danger, might receive much more serious injury. The question of whether Maegor was already dying when the blades found him, or whether the blades were the primary cause, is the question that the physical evidence could not answer and the witnesses would not answer. The realm's silence after Maegor's death was not simply the silence of relief, though relief was certainly present in the way that relief is present when a prolonged pressure is suddenly removed. It was also the silence of a world reorganizing itself around a new understanding, the understanding that the dynasty had survived its own worst version, that the fire had burned very hot and the thing it was attached to had burned out, and that the thing that came next was going to be different, because the thing that had just ended had been so comprehensive a demonstration of a particular way of doing things and their costs that the people who inherited the problem would have the example permanently available to them as a reference. Maegor had no monuments built in his honor. The kings who followed him did not commission the kind of official histories that the conquerors and the great administrators received, the kind that smooth the edges and emphasize the achievements and find ways to present the legacy as net positive. What they commissioned instead were records, the Archmeister Gildane's account of the reign, which is thorough and remarkably frank, which names what it names without excessive euphemism, which treats Maegor as a historical phenomenon worth understanding rather than a figure worth celebrating or simply condemning. That is, in its way, a more interesting kind of monument than the celebratory kind. It is the monument of a world that decided the most useful thing it could do with its experience of Maegor was to understand it. The breath comes in and it goes out, and the world grows quieter with each exchange. You are comfortable, you are warm. The stories have done what they came to do, which is to fill the spaces where the day's anxieties used to be with something older and stranger and ultimately more peaceful, because the past, for all its darkness, is settled. It is finished. It has already happened, and there is a particular peace in the company of things that are already done. Let Maegor's throne room go dark. Let the great wings of the Black Dread fold, finally, into the long sleep of very old things. Let the castle stand on its hill in the dark, holding its secrets the way it has always held them, completely and without apology. You are safe, you are at rest. The fire in the blood is very far away tonight, and your body knows only the quiet of the late hour and the warmth of wherever you have laid yourself down. Sleep well. The watch is ended. The stories will be here when you wake, unchanged and patient, as they have always been, older than kingdoms, quieter than dragonfire, and steady as the long turning of the world toward morning. If you liked this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that, and if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.